Hey everybody on YouTube, welcome back to my channel. Long time no see. I apologize for the long hiatus, and I know I'm behind on a lot of videos that I've been meaning to make for months now. I have my anti-colonial liberation work series that I have a list of videos I want to make for, and another video talking about the goddess Bridget and how she came into my life right when I've started this this most recent intense period of mental health work this year in 2020 during the clusterfuck that has been 2020. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about that. There's just so many things I've wanted to talk about, but I needed to take some time off to make progress on my work, but also make progress on the work that I've been doing on myself. So I hope you understand. But I'm back. Today is November 21st. It's the first day of Sagittarius season. I am a Sagittarius sun, and I actually have 4 planets in Sagittarius. I'll talk about that here in a bit, but I wanted to welcome you to a kind of mini-series about my mental health journey and what I've been reading and working on this year during Clusterfuck 2020. And how this has really been a bifurcation point kind of year. It's been the work that I'm doing now, it's kind of the culmination or the climax of mental health work. I don't even want to call it shadow work because it's more global than that. It's really self-work. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second, what I mean by the self and why it was important for me to work on myself, my sense of self, my egoic identity, my ego, myself. And the specific problems I've been working on within myself are things that I've been working on for over a decade, since I first received my first diagnosis over a decade ago, and I'll tell that story in a future video. But I finally feel like I understand where my mental health problems come from. I understand why I am the way that I am, basically. And I want to share resources, share my thoughts and perspectives, and also honor my experience. And I was watching Ember Honey Raven's channel. I've been watching her channel since like 2014, I think. She's one of the first witches and pagan folk that I've been following, that I discovered on YouTube, actually. I think the first one, actually. Either that or it was Kellyanne Maddox's video about the 6 principles of chaos magic. I can't remember which one I came across first, but Ember, if you're watching this, I love your channel, I love your input, and this month, through the whole month of November, she's had a really interesting series called Wedden, which is Witching Every Day in November. I'll have a link to her channel down below. And every day in November, she's been offering videos about various topics having to do with witchcraft, and so that kind of inspired me. There's doors slamming. You're probably going to hear my neighbors slamming doors, dogs barking outside, my partner in the office typing on the keyboard. It's just, this is life, right? This is life in Santiago, Chile, in my little corner of the world. So anyway, Ember Honey Raven has been uploading witchy videos every day in November as a way to kind of like rekindle her love for her craft and to share her thoughts and ideas about different topics having to do with witchcraft. And I thought, okay, I've been on this hiatus for a while. I'm looking for a way to kind of get back into the habit of making videos, but I don't think I have the time to make daily videos. So I figured, since I have 4 planets in my chart in Sagittarius, including my sun sign, and we're in Sagittarius season now, as of today. And my birthday is coming up, which is actually the last day in Sagittarius that the sun is in Sagittarius. I figured, why not take this Sagittarian energy and the energy of my sun sign and me feeling my groove again and feeling more like myself again for the first time in years and use this and take advantage of this energy to kind of talk about what I've been going through and to talk about some of the breakthroughs that I've had recently and to talk about the books that I've been reading and my thoughts about different topics related to mental health work, specifically childhood trauma and facing childhood trauma, doing that radical acceptance work of childhood trauma, returning to working on this stuff, because this is stuff that I was already kind of cognitively aware of, but I still had more work to do. I still had more radical acceptance work to do. I didn't realize to what extent that crap was still impacting me and my life. There's just a lot of stuff. I feel like my understanding of myself has grown exponentially in the clusterfuck of 2020. And maybe I really had that dark night of the soul moment this year. From late March, early April until now, basically, like for the last 6 to 9 months, it was one big long mental health crisis moment, dark night of the soul moment, but sometimes you need to lean into that darkness. You need to give yourself time to listen to it. And in that darkness, you find your guiding light, you know. It was definitely one of those years for me. It was definitely the culmination of several years of work for me. And the work isn't done, you know. The journey with childhood trauma and abuse and stuff like that, it's a lifelong journey. But I feel like I hit a growth spurt, right? So the first major caveat I want to offer here is I am not in any way, shape, or form a mental health expert or professional. I've been on the receiving end of mental health, professional mental health care. You know, I've been to therapy, I've talked to psychiatrists and psychologists, I have been hospitalized back in my early 20s, I have been on medication for different periods of time. I'm not on any medication now, but I'm not a professional at all, so I just want to be explicit about that. I did, however, in the 4 books that I'm going to talk about, the 4 books that I've read this year that have helped to make this the culmination of my journey so far. These 4 books were written by mental health professionals, right? So they're self-help books, but they're written by professionals with research and clinical and therapy experience. So in this Sagittarius season video series, which I still don't quite know how I'm going to call this, a few of the videos will be book review videos of the 4 books that I've read so far. Of course, I'm going to continue to read books. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's book, The Deepest Well, about childhood adversity and the impact of childhood adversity on, your mental and physical health, well into adulthood. I want to read that book. The Body Keeps the Score. I can't remember who wrote that, but that's also on my to-do list. I will keep reading. And if you have any suggestions for me or for everyone else Please comment down below if you've read self-help books written by mental health professionals that helped you to process trauma, especially trauma that resulted from experiences of neglect and abuse as throughout childhood, right? So feel free to comment down below. But the 4 books that I'm going to be talking about are, have them here, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, How to Heal from Distant, Rejecting, or Self-Involved Parents by Lindsay Gibson. And that was the first book that I read earlier this year, back in like April or May. And then I'm going to be talking about Healing Your Emotional Self, a powerful program to help you raise your self-esteem, quiet your inner critic, and overcome your shame, by Beverly Engel. And that book really helped me to identify my toxic inner critic and my self-esteem issues, which are very common with childhood experiences of abuse and neglect. Then I'll be talking about Will I Ever Be Good Enough? Healing the Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers by Carol McBride. And now I know, just kind of a quick mini caveat here, the term narcissist is kind of, in my opinion, overused and used out of context. I think a lot of people label other people narcissists without kind of understanding the differences between narcissist versus narcissistic personality disorder. I think there's just a lot of judgment, and I don't know, it's used almost in like an aggressive way, like, you're a narcissist, a very accusatory way, and maybe inappropriately. And so I'm going to kind of unpack that narcissist word when I talk about this book, because one of my parents displayed narcissistic behaviors, and I would label their abuse of me as narcissistic, but I wouldn't necessarily label them as a person as a narcissist, because I don't think that they have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, and I've actually seen them kind of change. I've seen them grow and change, especially since they started receiving professional mental health help in my mid-20s. I have noticed the change in their behavior, and so I think that narcissist word is kind of a tricky word, and I'm going to get into that when I talk about that book. So, you know, if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments down below. And then the final book, which is actually the book that I'm still working through, but the final book that I'm going to be talking about, there's a loud scooter or motorcycle driving by, sorry, is Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. And chances are, if you look on YouTube or you Google about complex PTSD or CPTSD, this book is going to come up, and everyone's going to reference this book because it's a very foundational and important book for working through complex PTSD. And so I'll dive into that book and talk about just how empowering and affirming it has been for me to read that book. I finally understand why I am the way that I am. My fear of abandonment and the abandonment depression, my flight response, you know, my left brain dissociation, which is, these are his terms, by the way, you know, distracting myself and using busy work and stuff as a way to dissociate from the emotional flashbacks and the pain of my childhood. You know, it's just been revolutionary, that book specifically. All these books together, but that book in particular, Pete Walker's book. So I'll have the titles of all the 4 books down below so you can look them up and learn about them yourself if you're interested. Another caveat that I want to give is that I am not officially diagnosed with CPTSD. I've only been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, which of course can coexist, or they're comorbid. I don't like the comorbid. Maybe I'm like, I get hooked on that, like, or tripped up by that morbid part. But comorbid just means like these coexisting kind of mental health issues, right? Or health issues. And so depression and anxiety and CPTSD have a relationship. CPTSD also, and trauma in general, or PTSD, can also have a coexisting kind of relationship with the personality disorders and with the identity disorders too. I don't exactly understand how all these things mix together, but I do know I've only been officially diagnosed with depression and anxiety. I have not been officially diagnosed with anything else. Actually, the next video I'm going to be making in this series is going to complicate. I kind of want to introduce some more nuance into how we talk about mental illness. And this question, or this idea that like you can't diagnose yourself, is something that I'm going to kind of unpack in the next video that I'm going to make. I also feel like I need to rant about my negative experiences with professional mental health care in the United States. And, you know, lack of access to it because of, you know, capitalism and all that bullshit. And so that's something I want to unpack a little bit in the next video. But just to be clear and explicit here, I have not been diagnosed by a professional that I have CPTSD, but I know I have CPTSD. And you know, save yourself the trouble. Don't rant at me like, you can't diagnose yourself because you're not a professional, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to unpack that in the next video. Stay tuned for that. Save yourself the time and save me the effort of going in and deleting your comment because I don't want to hear it. There's some, like, I think, assumptions built into that kind of accusation, like, you can't do this unless you're a professional, because professionals are people, professionals make mistakes, professionals can be assholes. And the DSM, it's a model of reality. It's not the complexity and, you know, it's not reality itself. It's just a model of reality. And sometimes reality is a little bit more complex than that. And also, I don't have access to professional mental health care right now. I don't have the money for it. I'm living in a Spanish-speaking country. I don't feel comfortable going to a therapist in Spanish because it's not my native language. It would be difficult, or it would be kind of awkward for me to like talk about my experience to someone in South America. You know, I just don't have the resources. I don't have access to it right now. So what the hell else am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? So for me, it's actually, it's been quite empowering to kind of go ahead and take charge of my mental health and take the reins in my own hands. I do understand the dangers of like people who lack the professional training and education acting like professionals. I completely understand that, you know, I 100% understand that. But I think there's some nuance there, and I like I said, I want to unpack that in an upcoming video. So stay tuned. And I decided actually to talk about this more explicitly thanks to someone who follows me on Instagram who commented on a recent post. If you're watching, thank you so much for your comment and for your support. It was really empowering. I think there's a dangerous aspect to taking the reins and taking matters into your own hands, of course, because, you know, as a non-professional, you have major blind spots and blah, blah, blah. However, it can be quite empowering and liberating to finally have a name for it, you know. CPTSD is something that just, I finally have a name for it. And with that name, I can then continue to research the problem, continue to learn about it, continue to read about it, right? So yeah, so if you're out there, thank you so much for your comment. It was very helpful. So now that I'm 20 minutes in, y'all know me, I'm long-winded. I am not a like 3-minute video person. I want to talk specifically about why I chose to do this during Sagittarius season. Besides the fact that my sun sign is Sagittarius, along with 3 other planets, and I'll get into that here in a second. Sagittarius, or the sun, let's start with the sun. And now I'm a novice in astrology. I'm still very much a beginner, so if there's anybody out there with like years of experience and someone who's knows more about what they're talking about than I do, please correct me down below. But for me, the sun sign I've always related to the ego or to the egoic identity. And I'm gonna have appear up here in the cards a book review by it has to do with transpersonal psychology. I can't remember the name of the author or the book, but I'll have it appear up here. It's a book review I did a little over a year ago about transpersonal psychology. And in this book, the author, Frances Vaughan, The Inner Arc, that's the name of the book, she talked about kind of our identities in terms of layers, and she's a transpersonal psychologist, so you know, the transpersonal self is one of the layers, and none of the layers are more important than the others, you know. They're all important, right? And they all deserve equal attention and balance and development. So you have the physical self, the emotional self, and the egoic self. The ego, the I am, you know. That is important. It's not the end all and be all, because beyond the egoic self you have like the relational self, you have the transpersonal self, but the ego is important. And for those of us who have gone through trauma in our childhood, especially if that trauma was at the hands, trauma, abuse, neglect, if that was at the hands of our primary caretakers, like your parents or grandparents or whoever was the adult in charge, that can have such a detrimental and negative impact on the development of your egoic self. For me, salud! For me, since my mother was my primary abuser, and I categorize or kind of label her abuse as narcissistic. Dinero! I wasn't allowed to individuate. She absorbed me into her own sense of self. She kind of acted like a totalitarian leader in the home. She controlled everything. She controlled the finances. Even though my father was the primary breadwinner, my mom controlled the money. To this day, she doesn't let my dad have his own copy of the checkbook or anything, so he has to go through her. She controlled what I wore, she controlled what I did with my time, she mocked me, she bullied me incessantly, like on a daily basis. It was hell. And so, since I wasn't allowed to have any sort of or any sense of autonomy in my life and in my decision making, it left me incomplete. My individuation process, my self-actualization, whatever you want to call it, my sense of self was incomplete until I reached adulthood and I was able to get out from under her control. But even then, I made mistakes. I was in abusive relationships, which is very common. If your parents were abusive, you might find yourself in an abusive romantic or even abusive friendships. Just, one thing led to another until finally in my mid to late 20s and now into my early 30s, I've been able to kind of clean up this mess myself. That's how it feels. And so the sun being, in my mind, related to the egoic identity, the I am, your sense of self, right? The center of your universe. You're, thinking of the heliocentric model of, the solar system and all that. The fact that the sun is in Sagittarius now, and I'm a sun sign and Sagittarius person, feels like good timing for me to talk about this kind of stuff, because this has really been the clusterfuck of 2020, but also all of the mental health work that I've been doing for over a decade has really been finding myself and empowering this sense of self and feeling safe to be myself, right? And I feel like a lot of people who've been through trauma in childhood and neglect and abuse can kind of resonate with that. So the sun being in Sagittarius, it's ruled by Jupiter, this expansive, benefic, is that the word? Again, I'm a novice in astrology, so, excuse my mistakes if I make any. But it's this expansive, focused on travel and learning and philosophy, and it is related to transcendence and the transpersonal. And so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Sagittarius as a sign specifically, and I'm going to use this book. This is in Spanish, but I'll translate off the top of my head when I share a few quotes from this book. This is called Un espejo cósmico, which is a cosmic mirror. The voyage or the journey of the soul through the wisdom of the 12 signs. And so this is written by Gonzalo Perez, and he is a psychologist at the University of Chile. Says he's a pioneer in humanistic and group psychotherapy, humanistic psychology and group psychotherapy. He studies myths, symbols, and astrology, and the wisdom traditions. He's worked with Dr. Lola Hoffman, and he's considered to be one of the most important experts in transpersonal psychology. And so that's the little blurb about him. There he is. So this book is probably only available in South America. I don't know how easily you can get your hands on it if you're, in the global north or whatever, but it's in Spanish. I don't think it's been translated into English. Catalonia Press, or is a publishing house, I think. I don't know if it's in Santiago. Yeah, in Santiago, Chile. But he talks about all 12 of the signs as the soul's journey through the process of individuation, starting from Aries to Pisces. And so let me open up to the Sagittarius chapter, because there's some really interesting things that he talks about. Let's see. Okay, and I'm kind of translating off the top of my head. I'll have the original Spanish appear here at the bottom. So he talks about Sagittarius. With Sagittarius, the heavens open up to the final signs of the zodiac, the signs of transcendence, the archetypes of the human connection with the cosmos. And I really resonate with that too. Sagittarius represents the human, el don humano, or the human gift of going beyond, or ir más allá. And that is something that when I first read that, I was like, oh my God, like cosmic synchronicity, because ir más allá means like beyond, going beyond, right? And so the very first tattoo that I got is this. I don't know if you could see it, right? I got this over a decade ago at this point. I've never touched up any of my tattoos. They need to be touched up badly. Like, tattoos are investments that you need to continually, update and invest in, and I have not done that. But eventually I will, when this whole pandemic and everything is over. But the top of the tattoo says plus ultra. Oh wait, it says plus ultra here, and más allá at the top. And plus ultra is the Latin for más allá, or beyond. And that is actually, it was kind of like the official phrase of the Spanish Empire, and I'm not a fan of imperialism, as you guys know. I study kind of Spanish imperialism and also, the history of colonialism in Latin America, and also US imperialism and colonialism. And so I'm not a fan of those things, but it kind of connects me to this experience of like having studied abroad in Spain, and now I'm living in South America. And this idea of going beyond, like anytime we think that there's a limit or a horizon, that's just an invitation for me in my Sagittarius brain. It's an invitation to go beyond that horizon, to go beyond these limits, right? There's a transcendence of limits and horizons in Sagittarius. And so the author, when he says that, it just rings true for me so much. He also talks about Sagittarius as the adventurer/philosopher, which I really vibe with too. He kind of breaks down the symbol of Sagittarius as the centaur, being that half human, half animal. And it's that connection of where the earth or the animalistic nature meets the heavens or the cosmos, or like the human potential for that transcendence and connection to the cosmos. He says, Sagitario en nosotros intuye y anhela esa sabiduría liberadora. And so that means Sagittarius within us intuits and craves that liberating wisdom. And liberating wisdom just rings true for me. I have another tattoo here, which I got a couple years after I got this one. And this is basically, it's Sumerian cuneiform, and it means freedom or liberation. It literally means return to the mother. The mother being that primal, definitionless chaos, right? But it's taken to mean like liberation or freedom, which is something, this idea of freedom is something that manifests itself very literally in my life. And Sagittarius, I find, has also manifested itself very literally in my life. I mean, even this idea of travel. I'm an American or a US American citizen. Both of my parents are US Americans, but I was born in West Germany. I'm dating myself here because this was back before the Berlin Wall fell, and so I was born on a military base in West Germany. I've studied in Spain. I've, traveled a lot. I have lived all up and down the east coast of the US, and now I'm here in South America, and I'm married to a Chilean citizen. And so travel and higher learning are things that just manifest themselves very explicitly in my life. And so that's one of the many reasons why Sagittarius just rings true for me. And now, to kind of close off this video, I want to talk about the Sun in Sagittarius in relation to the other planets in my birth chart that are also in the same house and in Sagittarius. So my rising sign is Cancer, and my moon sign is Capricorn. And so if you use the whole sign house system, then just with me telling you that my rising sign is Cancer, you know that Sagittarius rules my 6th house. So my sun sign, my Sun, my Mercury, my Uranus, and Saturn are all in the 6th house, and they're all in Sagittarius. And so the 6th house, from what I gather, has to do with health, and that includes both well-being but also illness. It has to do with your daily responsibilities, your work, your discipline, your duty, right? And how you face adversity, which is really interesting. So for my sun sign to be in that house specifically, that to me just kind of highlights this need to complete my process of individuation, how myself, my egoic self, my idea of myself has been damaged and held back by the trauma and the child abuse and neglect, right? Which has also manifested itself over the years in physical health problems, not just mental health problems. In Pete Walker's book about complex PTSD, he talks about the process of armoring, where you kind of tense your muscles because you're in that kind of like fight or flight, hyper-vigilant state all the time. And man, that is something that I've struggled with for a long time, probably about close to 8 years ago. When I was in my master's degree program, I had a really, really bad spike of that, especially in my shoulders. It's in my shoulders where I do this, like I'm ready to fight, flight, freeze or fawn. My go-to is flight, apparently. I learned that recently in that book. And it was so bad to where, especially on my right, I'm right-handed, and so the tension that I felt here went all the way down my arm and made my wrist and my hand swell up and caused excruciating pain, like as if I had really bad carpal tunnel or something. I couldn't even make a fist with my hand. Like, that's how stiff and inflamed everything was. And it all had to do with that trauma being triggered and that armoring process. And so the sixth house, with this theme of health, wellness, but also illness, that the detrimental impact of the trauma was still affecting me. And it was, like I said, it's not just mental illness or struggles, it was also physical illness and struggles. I also, a few years after that, after I got a handle on that, I went through a year of recurrent yeast infections and UTIs. I even ended up in the emergency room with a kidney infection that was the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. And I also, a couple years after that, had sciatic pain that lasted for a year at least. And it all, to me, goes back to the impact of trauma on the body. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that my Sagittarian sun is in the sixth house, and how that points to the need for ego work and for healing. Mercury being in the sixth house, also in Sagittarius, has more to do, I think, with my career, with how I'm writing a dissertation right now, and writing is a process of communication, and so my dissertation is very theoretical, and so having Mercury in Sagittarius conjunct with my sun, and the discipline of having to sit down every day and do the work and all of that, and work on my communication skills too, and how that can have an impact on my career and on my work, and that makes sense to me. Uranus as that force of chaos and liberation and change and boundary pushing in Sagittarius is really interesting. I think that's where I get a lot of my drive, and that focus on liberation. I get that from my Uranus, and having Saturn in Sagittarius, and Saturn being that planet of restriction and limits and defining things, and just limitations that might balance out Uranus, but also point to the need for more discipline. You know, I'm still unpacking a lot of this, but it's really interesting to have those 4 planets all in the 6th house, all in Sagittarius, and you know, reflecting on how those kind of make sense in my life. And so being in Sagittarius, you know, the sun being in Sagittarius right now, it just seems like the right time for me to put together this series and to share my experiences and my thoughts and these book reviews. And I'm also going to talk about some spell work that is geared towards what I call ego magic, and I'm going to kind of unpack a little bit more what I mean by the ego and ego magic, because I think in like alternative spiritual circles, the ego kind of gets a bad rap because it's used like synonymously with selfishness, or I don't even know. I think there's some unpacking that I need to do there. So I'm going to talk about ego magic and spell work related to ego magic as a part of this little mini series. The book reviews, of course. I might return to astrology a little bit. Let me see. I'm going to talk about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and how that has also helped to revolutionize my understanding of myself. And let's see. Oh, I'm also going to share my perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and procrastination tarot spreads. So this is a long-ass video as an introductory video, but that's just how I am. I talk a lot, y'all. I'm so excited for this mini-series during this Sun in Sagittarius season, from November 21st until my birthday on December 21st. I'm excited to share what I've learned about myself and what I've learned from these books, and to share resources, especially for people who, like me, might not have access to professional mental health care at the moment. So stay tuned. You'll see me again in a few days with the next video, and thank you so much for your support. Welcome back to the channel. Please feel free to comment down below with your own experiences, with your own, you know, what is your sun sign, and do you kind of relate that to your egoic identity too? How do you understand that in your birth chart? Feel free to share whatever you're comfortable with sharing. And until next time, happy Sagittarius season and many blessings. Bye.